welcome. My name is Racho, and today I am here with another Warframe video, and I am going to basically explain why armor is bad in the game. Now, if you're a newer player or just getting to understand the game a bit better, you've probably heard people say that armor is really bad, and you probably don't understand why or even thought they're wrong. Well, they're not wrong. Armor is really bad. Well, that isn't actually necessarily true. What is true, however, is armor isn't normally worth modding for, making it a wasted mod slot. There's a bit of a difference between that than just outright saying armor is bad, but because armor isn't worth modding for, it is kind of bad. Comparatively to other options, then yes, it is bad. But why is this? Why is armor so bad in this game? Well, before I can explain why armor is so bad in the game, you have to understand two important things about the game. And the first one is how damage reductions stack, and the other one is mod slots. Not mod capacity, mod slots. So first of all, how do damage reductions stack? Well, what I mean by this is when you have more than one damage reduction on the same Warframe, how does that work? Say I'm playing Gara and I've casted her second ability, giving me a 90% damage reduction, but I also have adaptation, which also gives me a 90% damage reduction. How do these two work? Well, it's simple. All damage reductions in the game are multiplicative with each other. This means that Gara's second ability will take away 90% of the damage you take, leaving 10% of the damage, and then adaptation will then take away another 90% of that remaining 10%, which in total only leaves 1%. Basically giving you 99% damage reduction. The next thing you have to understand is that shields have a native damage reduction when health doesn't. So health doesn't have native damage reduction, that's what armor is for. Armor is what gives health its damage reduction, and it does not affect shields, it only affects armor. So that in itself is actually one of the reasons why armor is considered bad, because it doesn't affect shields. While shields have a native 50% damage reduction. So if I was to mod on adaptation on a Warframe that doesn't have any native damage reduction through abilities or whatever, you may look at adaptation and say, oh, I'm getting 90% damage reduction. But that's not actually true, because when I'm taking damage to my shields, I'm not getting 90% damage reduction, I'm actually getting 95% damage reduction, because shields have a native 50% damage reduction. So I get 90% from adaptation, and then I get an extra 50%, leaving behind only 5% of the damage, giving me 95% damage reduction. This also means that on Gara, if you were taking damage to your shields, you'd actually get a 99.5% damage reduction, because you get 90% from our second, 90% from adaptation, and of course 50% from shields. And this works the same with armor. Let's say I have 300 armor, which gives me 50% damage reduction, and I have adaptation on me. I don't have 50% damage reduction. I don't have 90% damage reduction. I have 95% damage reduction because of the armor and adaptation. So that's the first thing you understand. Damage reduction stack and how they stack. The next thing you have to understand is mod slots, not mod capacity, mod slots. Mod capacity doesn't matter. We have former, we have catalyst, reactors. We can always get more mod capacity if we need it. Mod slots, though, are limited, and there is no way to increase our mod slots. We only have 8 mod slots. Sure, you have your Aura slot and your Extra slot, but it's unlikely that either of those two slots will be used for survivability purposes. Meaning, you only have 8 mod slots, and you have to be conservative with how you use them to make an actually good build. In addition to those 8 mod slots, you also have your 2 arcane slots, which is the same. 2 arcane slots and 8 mod slots are not a lot. They might seem like a lot, but let me put it this way. On a typical build, you will need 3 things on a Warframe. This doesn't apply to every Warframes, as some Warframes have abilities that makes it so you don't have to mod for one of these 3 things, but generally speaking, you have to have 3 things on a Warframe. Something every Warframe needs is modding for your damage rotation. This could mean modding to increase the amount of damage your abilities do, modding to increase the duration of abilities, range, streamline, efficiency, anything like that. That's what I mean by modding for your damage rotation. Modding for your actual abilities. And that could take up anywhere between 4 to 5 slots, which is half or more than half of your slots you have. And You could have, there are frames that need less mods when it comes to damage rotation, and some frames will only need 3 slots. But you won't get a frame that needs less than 3, and even 3 is very rare. Generally speaking, the minimum amount of slots you want to give to your damage rotation is 4. That means you have 4 or even 3 slots left for survivability and energy economy, which are the other 2 things you need to mod for. If you don't have all 3 of these things on your build, you have a bad build. If you don't have the damage rotation needed, your damage output won't be good enough. If you don't have the survivability, well, obviously you'll die. And if you don't have the energy economy, well, there was no real point modding for damage output anyway, because you can't cast your abilities because you don't have the energy economy. You need these 3 things or you have a bad build. That's the simple truth of it. And when it comes to energy economy, typically you only need 1 mod slot and 1 arcane slot, and that's for primed flow and a max arcane energize. But if you don't have a max arcane energize, you might need to get more creative. You might need to give up 2 mod slots with equilibrium as well as primed flow. You might need to run nourish, which is giving up your helmet slot, and all this stuff. But you generally don't need that much stuff when it comes to energy economy. For survivability though, survivability can range how many mod slots you need depending on the kind of setup you're going for. You could have a health tank setup on a Warframe that only needs 1 mod slot and 1 arcane slot. Shield tanking typically needs 2 mod slots, which would be rolling guard and catalyzing shields. Shield tanks can range anywhere between 3 mod slots to only 1 mod slot. And even health tanks can sometimes need 2 mod slots instead of just the 1. So the amount of survivability you want could range typically from 1 mod slots to 3 mod slots. And you need to fit that in with your damage rotation as well as your energy economy within these 8 mod slots. So if we're saying we want at least 4 mod slots for our damage rotation, and we're saying we need a maximum of 3 for our survivability, and we're saying we need 2 to 1 for energy economy, that's 9 mod slots. We're already over, and I was saying pretty conservatively with that. So obviously it depends from frame to frame. Invisibility frames don't have to worry about survivability, generally speaking. Some frames don't have to worry about energy economy. It varies, but when you explain it that way, you can get a good picture of how much mods you actually need to fit on to make a decent, even a half decent build, because you need to balance between these 3 things. And it's not like you can give yourself more survivability and more energy economy and trade off your damage rotation. Because at the end of the day, the thing that's going to give you the most survivability and energy economy is killing enemies faster. Because when you kill enemies faster, there's less enemies to shoot at you, and it also means more energy drops from enemies. So you always want to prioritize your damage rotation more than energy economy and survivability, but you still want to have the survivability and energy economy to actually keep your damage rotation functional. So you need to balance these 3 things. So you need to be very careful about what mods you're putting on your Warframe. And that's where the concept of this is a wasted mod slot, that is a wasted mod slot comes in. Because mod slots are incredibly valuable, and so are arcanes, because you can have wasted arcane slots as well. And that's why people say armor is a wasted mod slot. But why? Why do people say modding for armor is a wasted mod slot? Now that you know those 2 things, how does that mean that modding for armor results in a wasted mod slot? Well, you have to understand how armor works in this game. To begin with, the formula for armor is that you take your armor value, so say it's 100, and then you plus that by 300. So 100 plus 300 is of course 400. Then you take that new number, which in our case is 400, and then you divide the original armor value, which is 100, by that new number. So 100 divided by 400, which is of course 0.25. And then to convert that to a percentage, all you have to do is times it by 100, and you give your damage reduction you get from armor. This works for any number. You could do 300, and simply add another 300 to get 600, then divide 300 by 600, that's 0.5, which gives us 50% damage reduction. And that's how armor is calculated. That is the actual formula for how armor is calculated. Now, if you're already figuring it out, you may notice that this leads to armor to be very bottom heavy, meaning the more armor you have, the less you start to get in return from armor. But more on that later. If we say that we want to health tank, so we want armor, because if we're shield tanking or shield gating, obviously armor is useless anyway because it only works on health. But let's say we are health tanking, so we want armor on we want we may want armor on our build, right? Why would you choose to have armor instead of, let's say, adaptation? So I actually went through on the Warframe wiki comparison page, and I sorted all the Warframes based on their armor values, and I counted to around about 52, which is roughly around about the medium amount of Warframes, the primes included, we have right now. It's not accurate. I don't know the exact amount. It's probably like 52, 54, somewhere in that benchmark, right? To get roughly what the medium armor value of all the Warframes in the game is. Meaning, to give you a good idea of generally where armor sits. And it's 185. So how much damage reduction does 185 give you? It gives you 38% damage reduction. Roughly. I'm rounding down, obviously, but I'm rounding to the nearest whole number. But rounding, it's a 38% damage reduction. So if I modded Steel Fiber, which increases my my armor value by 100%, so essentially I'm timesing my armor value by 2, how much damage reduction do I get after that? So 185 times 2 is, of course, 370. So how do we figure out the amount of damage reduction we get from 370 armor? Well, we simply just add 300, and then we take that new number away from the original value. So we simply divide 370 by 670, which gives us around about a 55% damage reduction. So we went from a 38% damage reduction to 55% damage reduction. Now, let me ask you this. If we choose to mod Steel Fiber on our Warframe, and remember, we have limited mod space, we now have 55% damage reduction. Where instead, I could have put it on adaptation, and suddenly, I would have not 90% damage reduction, but I would have 90% damage reduction on top of the 38% damage reduction I already had from from my base armor. So I have, in fact, 93.8% damage reduction. So let me ask you, which is better, a 93.8% damage reduction or a 55% damage reduction? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to work that one out. But what if you said, well, I want a mod for adaptation and Steel Fiber, then you would result in having a 95.5% damage reduction. And you're right, you would. But we already discussed that mod slots on a Warframe are finite. You don't have that many mod slots on a Warframe, or in guns, anything in this game, but for this context, specifically Warframe. And you don't want to be jumping on Steel Fiber to give you a simple 2% increase to your damage reduction, when you could be putting on a mod that could increase your strength, your duration, your energy, something to make your build feel and play better, which would honestly result in better survivability anyway if we're talking about damage reduction, if it means you're going to be killing enemies faster. So what is better? To give yourself that 2% increase in damage reduction, or give yourself more damage, meaning there's less enemies? I also don't think it takes a genius to figure that one out. That's what people say when they're saying that armor is a wasted mod slot. But that calculation was based on a Warframe that had an armor value of 185, which honestly, although is the medium armor value of Warframes, isn't a lot of armor. Take Corvex, which has the highest armor value in the entire game. He has an armor value of 875. What about frames like Wukong? What about frames like Hydroid? Even Grendel? Or these are all frames that can increase the armor by 750, even 150 if we're talking about Wukong. He increases his armor by 1,500, They can, or even Arcane Guardian, which increases your armor value by 900. These are massive increases to your armor value. And it actually does make a difference. When you can increase your armor value by so much, you actually do get to be it actually definitely does make a difference. Because Corvex has 875 armor, and Steel Fiber times armor by 2, obviously we get a lot more armor from just modding on Steel Fiber. We get 1,750. And how much damage reduction does 1,750 give us? Around about 85% damage reduction. And if we pair that with adaptation, that's 98.5% damage reduction. But that's a special case because Corvex just has an unbelievable amount of armor at base. Well, what about if we go back to the medium armor value of 185 and we add Arcane Guardian on? That increases our armor value to 1,085. That will end up giving us a 78% damage reduction. And these are noticeable buffs that are actually pretty decent. So, in the case of Arcane Guardian, is it then worth to mod for Steel Fiber on top of Arcane Guardian? Well, Steel Fiber would increase our base stat, giving us 370 armor, and then Arcane Guardian would give us another 900 on top of that, giving us 1,270 armor, which will give us 80% damage reduction. So we increased our armor value by 200, but we only increased our damage reduction by 2. And that's the other issue with armor. It's the fact that it has massive diminishing returns. What this means is the more armor you have, the less value you get out of adding more armor onto it. This is why things like Arcane Guardian, Corvex's ridiculous amount of armor, or things like Wukon's third ability are good because they can give you a massive amount of armor without having to sacrifice things that often. Even Arcane Guardian, however, does take away a mod slot, so you also don't really want to use it because an arcane slot, so you also don't really want to use it because that arcane slot could be very valuable for something else. And even on Corvex, if you don't have the mod space to have both Steel Fiber and Adaptation, it's still better to run Adaptation because Steel Fiber is only going to give you 80% damage reduction, but Adaptation is going to give you more than 90% damage reduction. In fact, on Corvex, a running Adaptation will give you 97.4% damage reduction because of his base armor. So even in those circumstances, you still don't want to run Steel Fiber because Steel Fiber isn't increasing your armor by that much. It is giving up a mod slot for very, very little returns, especially since Adaptation exists. It works on shields, it works on health, and it stacks with armor. It stacks with the native shield reduction. Yes, there are circumstances where I might want to consider running Arcane Guardian, but those circumstances are rare because an arcane slot is as valuable, if not more valuable, than a mod slot. Especially because Arcane Blessing exists. And if I'm health tanking, which is the only reason why I would be using armor, then I want to have health. And Arcane Blessing is going to be much more valuable than Vitality because it gives me 1,200 health on top of the health I already have, instead of simply doubling my health like what Vitality does. So why would I give up a arcane slot for armor when I could be running more health and simply just using Adaptation instead? It just gives you much better returns all the way around. And when you consider that literally every other option in terms of damage reduction is a better option than armor, that's why armor is bad. And that's why armor is the worst form of damage reduction in the game and why it's not worth modding for. So I do hope this video was informative and helpful, and maybe got you to better understand why armor is looked down upon so badly in this community, because, well, it's generally just not very good. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, do check out some of my other content. I hope to be making more videos like this to better explain the systems in this game so people can better learn it and get better at modding. And obviously I do more build videos than anything else, so if you have a Warframe that you just got and you're not really sure how you want to build them, check out some of my videos. I may have a video out for them. Anyway, until next time, bye bye.